Hello and welcome to this bite-sized recording focused on feedback from the Chief Examiner reports from the Summer 2025 Digital Support Services T-Level. This video will identify key themes arising from the core exams and the ESPs in cybersecurity, network cabling and digital infrastructure and digital support. So this video will be split into three parts. First of all, we'll have a look at core papers A and B and some question-by-question insights. Then we'll have a look at the ESP feedback, and that's around all of the ESPs, digital support, network cabling and digital infrastructure, and cybersecurity. And then we'll also have a look at some teaching strategies for development moving forward. We'll start first of all by looking at some of the overall trends across the core papers A and B. So in this series, students generally performed well, and overall they answered most questions across papers A and B. However, students did appear to struggle with some of the command verbs, for example, describe, state, analyse and so on. It would be helpful here for providers to ensure that students understand the difference between these verbs. Students also lost marks due to not providing reasoned judgments and conclusions, and this was identified within many questions. And overall, there was a range of achievements seen throughout, including some exceptional answers on the 15-mark questions from a small selection of students, although there were also a high number of students who did not attempt to answer any of the 15-mark questions at all. So now we'll take a look more deeply into the strengths and areas for development arising from core paper A, breaking the themes down by question. So we'll start with section A, which is business context and culture. In terms of strengths here, multiple choice questions and straightforward identification tasks were generally answered well. Specific examples of this include question 2, identifying organisational change steps, question 3A, the impacts of digital reliance on society, 5A, question around internal stakeholders, and question 6, ways to add customer value. In terms of mixed responses, these tended to be around short explain tasks where students gave a reason but failed to relate that to the company or scenario. Examples of this include 3B, when discussing the ethical or moral impacts of AI, these were often not applied to the company. Question 4A, economic factors, students generally confused external versus economic. And there were issues on 4B around the understanding of multi-factor authentication benefits, again not often related to the company or context. And 5B, competitor impact, was not linked to the scenario. Discuss style questions, for example question 8 and 9, often lacked a reasoned judgment or conclusion, therefore not achieving full marks. Then the weaker areas overall on section A tended to be when students needed to give scenario-linked evaluations on longer responses. For example, they failed to relate answers back to the scenario or to produce conclusions. Examples here included question 7, in linking responses to the case study, this was an issue, and on question 8, they failed to provide reasoned judgments or conclusions. And then on question 9, where regarding ethical implications and societal impacts, there was undeveloped analysis here as well. And now we move on to section B, which was diversity, inclusion and digital environments. So strengths here included question 11, which was a multiple choice question. Question 13, identifying peripherals. Question 15A, OSI model layers. And the effective benefits of digital inclusion, which is question 16. And most students scoring well on these questions. Cloud computing on question 19 also showed generally high marks with full answers and evaluations. In terms of mixed responses, question 12, which was application software categories, students tended to name products rather than types. And explanation of why components matter in question 13B showed some good knowledge, but others lacked depth. And this was the same in question 15B, where students, for example, described CPU, but not its importance for gaming system performance. And then the weaker areas were question 17 around the discuss virtualisation and inclusive recruitment tasks. So many gave partial discussion points but missed developed discussions and conclusions. Conceptual understanding of virtualisation and network protocols on question 18. Again, more developed discussion was needed here. And now we'll move on to section C from core paper A, which was around learning and planning. So again, we'll start with the areas of strength. So in questions 21 to 24, the short answer knowledge, for example, identification and explanation of tasks, was mostly good. And some of this content area included the following: emerging technologies, project planning consequences, people and skills in planning, knowledge resources, reliability and validity in research, quality management techniques, and project planning reflection. In terms of the mixed and areas for development, this was mainly around question 25, which was design thinking. So it was a discuss style question and many students failed to give reasons, judgments or conclusions. So based on those areas for development that we've discussed, we're going to look at some teaching strategies to support with teaching the elements for core paper A. So starting with section A, which was the business context and culture, think about using scenario application, so integrating real company case studies into lessons. And you could use brand students know things like Netflix or Amazon to explore economic, ethical or stakeholder factors in context. Develop ethical and moral reasoning by using things like structured debate and reflection tasks, where students could debate the pros and cons of things like AI usage in business, and they get them to write short reflections linking to company reputation or culture. And practice teaching evaluation skills, so using things like the PEAL or PEAC model, so point, exam, explain, apply, conclude. And get students to practice extending short answers into 4-point paragraphs with scaffold. You can use change management exercise, so where students can role play a change advisory board meeting to make decisions and record justifications. And make sure students are aware of the command words, so do weekly exam literacy starter tasks where they need to identify what explain, assess, discuss and evaluate mean. And you can use mini practice questions to support with this. And make sure to distinguish between the command verbs so students are clear of expectations. Now we'll move on to look at the key strengths and areas development arising from core paper B. So starting with section A, which is the digital support services pathway. In terms of strengths, question 1 to 6, there was a good basic performance across a range of topics, and this included things like troubleshooting frameworks, work-based learning benefits, fault analysis tools, interaction with managers, and the roles within support teams. In terms of mixed and areas for development, some students misread what the question referenced. For example, in question 3A, job titles versus job routes. And in question 4B, students responded based on their generic 4A answers rather than relating the skills to the brief. In the assess style questions, such as 7 and 8, there was commonly a loss of marks because students did not supply 3 distinct assessment points, reasoned, judgments and a conclusion. So overall, the areas for development were around extended responses requiring evaluation or conclusion and scenario application of skills to the context of the brief. And now moving on to section B, which was around the tools and testing. So areas of strength here included knowledge around questions 9 to 12, and this was things like marketing, analytics purpose, Gantt reasons, components to test, and mostly these were all fine for identification. And then in terms of mixed areas and areas for development, on question 11B, many described usability generally rather than why it matters for the scenario. On question 12B, the known environment testing often lacked a second explanatory mark. And on question 13, many students didn't link their answers back to the scenario. On question 14, the financial analytics, many responses lacked a conclusion. And then on question 15, around project management methodology, there was variable evaluative skills noted here. So again, discuss and assess style questions were missing multiple discussion points and conclusions, and the contextualisation of testing within the scenario. And now we'll look at Core Paper B Section C, which was security and legislation. So in terms of strengths here, questions 16 to 20 and question 24, students could identify things like legislation, vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting behaviour, and could produce strong answers on ransomware. This was particularly clear in question 4, where the 12-mark question produced some high marks. And then in terms of the mixed areas and areas for development, around the discussed questions, which was 21, 22 and 23, students often gave only 1 point, missing the required conclusion and discussion depth. For example, when linking vulnerabilities and impacts to the scenario in 18B, and the evaluation around the role of the British Computer Society in question 21. And finally, we'll look at Core Paper Section D, the data and digital analysis. So in terms of strength, the questions where practical applications were required, which was question 25, 29, 31 and 35. On these questions, many students achieved full marks where the task was clearly linked to the scenario and to the explanation required. So content here included identifying common data types, flowchart benefits, and using performance data to inform improvement. There was also strong reasoning on the 12-mark information systems evaluation question. Then in terms of mixed outcomes, on question 26, user access controls, this demonstrated variable knowledge. And on question 27, around decomposition, this also demonstrated a partial understanding. And then on question 34, the structured English contained limited discussion points. And the weaker areas here, question 27A around algorithm knowledge and applications of algorithms in question 28, and in question 38 data formats. Here many students lacked domain knowledge or misread the specification language. For example, confusing data types with data formats. And in the evaluation and assessment style questions, so this would be 32, 33 and 34, often only 1 point was given and there was weak depth and limited judgment. The algorithm application and analysis was weak, with a weak conceptual understanding, as was the relational database assessment in question 33. And now moving on to some suggested teaching strategies for Core Paper B. So starting with section A, which is the digital support services pathway. Use scenario applications such as mock company support tickets, where students analyse fictional support issues and write responses linked to team roles and frameworks. You could use a 3-point writing frame where you model 3 distinct assessment points, for example, benefit, impact and conclusion. And get students to use communication skills in context. So you could role play IT support interactions and getting students to practice technical and non-technical communication through mock calls or ticket updates. And then you could use guided flowchart creations to encourage students to build flowcharts for incident response processes. And now section B, which was the tools and testing section. So you could simulate upgrade tasks where students plan and test a mock software update and record findings in test logs. And then use model answer workshops for analytical writing, where students would compare a 1-mark versus full mark discussed responses, and they would need to identify missing evaluative elements. For Agile versus Waterfall simulation, you could get teams to plan the same mini project using both methods and reflect on which worked best. And then use practical dashboards such as Excel or Power BI as mock-ups to explore how analytics inform decision making. And then section C, security and legislation. So you could use case study analysis where students could look at real data breach scenarios and link them to relevant laws and regulations. Use sentence scaffold for 3-mark discuss questions. So, for example, get students to practice writing 2 points and a conclusion. You could use a hack the system type simulation where students identify vulnerabilities in mock systems and suggest secure solutions. And think about role play, for example, a British Computer Society role play where students act as compliance officers defending their company's ethical actions. And then lastly, section D, the data and digital analysis. So use visual flowchart and pseudocode activities where students would need to convert a written process firstly into a flowchart and then into pseudocode. You could use sorting and matching tasks where students match examples such as CSV or relational databases to correct format categories. Make students create practical databases, so you could use Access or Airtable to demonstrate entity relationships. And then get students to use real-life performance data, such as analysing player statistics from sports teams and recommend improvements. So now we've looked at the core exams, we're going to move on and explore the key themes from the range of DSS ESPs. So again, we'll explore the main strengths that students demonstrated for each pathway, as well as the areas where challenges remain. We'll start with the cybersecurity ESP. So strengths here for task 1, many demonstrated a logical structured approach in their fault finding reports. Test plan layouts were clear and well structured and headings followed correctly, and students used relevant functional and security testing steps. In task 2, students communicated confidently and used open questions effectively, and many achieved high marks for email writing, adapting tone for both technical and non-technical audiences. And analytical writing and professionalism improved compared to previous series. For task 3, most students identified suitable upgrade paths, for example, enterprise grade routers. Students used basic mathematical calculations using things like totals, subtotals and recurring versus one-off costs. And extended analysis, for example, by comparing alternative approaches and products, was also a strength. In task 4, there were some strong survey designs with clear, concise, relevant questions and use of rating scales. Some students effectively linked survey outcomes to system performance and user satisfaction, and post-project reviews showed improvement in connecting solutions to initial problems. And now the cybersecurity areas for development. So in task 1, some students failed to explain the cause of issues in depth, for example, why the firewall blocked access. Few mentioned endpoint protection or group policies beyond basic fixes. And user C's issue was poorly handled. Students suggested unsuitable soft solutions, for example, allowing games at set times. Some test plans were incomplete or lacked reasoning behind the tests. And then on task 2, some students stuck rigidly to scripted questions and therefore didn't demonstrate active listening. And a few providers over-supported students by giving direct answers. Non-technical emails sometimes included jargon without explanation, and also poor recording quality affected clarity in some cases. And moving on to task 3, there was limited depth when discussing managed versus unmanaged switches or Wi-Fi encryption. Students often listed tools or services but did not justify their choice or explore full suites. For example, you could ask students, have we covered SharePoint, Intune, Azure AD? Integration and justification were weak. Many proposals lacked explanation of how solutions interconnect. And the overuse of AI content led to generic, non-analytical writing. Few comparative cost analyses between cloud versus on-premises solutions were seen. And then task 4. Some students omitted key indicators in their surveys, things like user satisfaction, performance or usability, and there were descriptive rather than evaluative reflections in post-project reviews. Students sometimes included irrelevant detail from other tasks, and there was a lack of depth in evaluating effectiveness of their own proposal. The following teaching and learning strategies could support learners in improving their performance in the cybersecurity ESP. So start with task 1. You could use the 5 whys technique for troubleshooting in lessons. For example, present students with mini case studies where they would trace a cyber issue from symptom through to cause using structured questioning. Scaffold test documentation, so you could give students a partially completed test plan and ask them to fill in missing sections such as purpose, expected result or outcome. And teach explain why impact change to develop depth of explanation, where students would rework short answers by adding one sentence for why and another for impact on the users or network. In task 2 around interview skills, you could role play active listening scenarios where students interview their peers and practice paraphrasing or rephrasing responses to show engagement. Compare formal versus informal emails where students rewrite a technical email for a non-technical recipient, removing jargon but keeping accuracy. And do the Explain to a Manager challenge, where students summarise a cyber issue to both a technician and a senior leader in 2 different styles. In terms of task 3, the project proposal, be useful to do some explicit teaching of AI policy so students practice distinguishing between AI generated and original work, citing tools they used. And spreadsheet modelling could help with the cost analysis in terms of comparing total cost of ownership, for example, for on-premise versus cloud systems using real supplier data. And then in task 4 for the survey and post-project review. Model question types, so get students to create survey drafts, swap with peers and critique question clarity and type data. And for evaluation skills, think about what worked why and evidence framework, so students could analyse a past project, listing successes, causes and supporting data. You could use a self-evaluation rubric, such as a reflection checklist, to focus on improvement and reasoning rather than description. And practice timeline mapping, so learners map how task 3 leads into task 4, for example, ensuring continuity of proposal and evaluation. We'll have a look first of all then at the network cabling and digital infrastructure ESP strengths. So for task 1, there was clear improvement in how students approach troubleshooting and documentation. For example, most were able to correctly identify the dual DHCP service issue on both the router and the server. Some higher level responses provided contextual justification, and several students identified scope size issues and made sensible recommendations for future capacity. On task 2, strengths included students showing strong communication skills and asking clear and structured questions. Most were able to lead interviews effectively and adapt to responses. And there was a significant improvement in technical and non-technical email writing. Many demonstrated clear adaptation of tone and vocabulary. Additionally, analytical and problem-solving language was stronger in technical emails. Then moving on to task 3. Most students identified key network performance issues and were able to correctly link hardware and cloud services, for example Microsoft 365, to the scenario needs. Mathematical skills improved, so spreadsheets were used correctly for subtotals, totals and cost differentiation. And then on task 4, strengths included students using clear, structured survey formats with mixed question types. Rating scales and qualitative questions were increasingly well designed, and some students linked the survey results back to the user experience and performance, and therefore there was an improved ability to connect solutions to initial problems in the post-project review. And now we'll have a look at the areas for development for the ESP in network cabling and digital infrastructure. So with task 1, explanations often lack depth and justification for technical recommendations. For example, many students failed to explain why DHCP needed to be disabled on one device. Test plans were sometimes missing verification steps, for example, ping or traceset commands or file access testing. And some students described extra troubleshooting steps instead of actual tests to confirm fault resolution. For task 2, the interview and emails, some students stuck too rigidly to pre-planned questions, therefore limiting interaction. Active listening and follow-up questioning were weak for a smaller number, and a few providers over-assisted by reading prompts or providing answers. There were some audio quality issues such as background noise and inaudible voices that affected assessment, and some non-technical emails still included unexplained jargon. On task 3, explanations often lacked justification and integration of proposed components, like how the parts all fit together. Supplier choices were not justified or rationalised for consistency. Some proposals were too brief, just 1 or 2 pages, and lacked sufficient technical detail. For example, students failed to mention bring your own device, risks and security implications. AI misuse increased, so copied generic content reduced authenticity and depth, and few attempted comparative cost evaluation. Network diagrams often missed key elements such as VPNs, cloud storage and backup servers. And then task 4, the survey and post-project review. Some surveys missed key indicators such as user satisfaction, performance and usability. Post-project reviews were descriptive rather than evaluative, and several did include irrelevant content from other tasks, showing a lack of focus. Many did not reflect critically on their own performance or propose improvements. And now we'll have a look at some suggested teaching strategies for the ESP and network cabling and digital infrastructure. So for task 1, you could use explain why impact sentence frames where students rework shorter answers. Use comparative analysis, so get students to compare router versus service-based DHCP in different environments. Simulate troubleshooting labs, so get students in small groups to simulate misconfigured networks in something like Packet Tracer, and document a test plan using ping or traceset and file share checks. Practice technical report writing by using annotated exemplars, so provide model step-by-step guides highlighting where justification can earn higher marks. In task 2, promote active listening through role-play adaptive interviews, where students practice rephrasing, paraphrasing and asking follow-up questions based on responses. Ensure communication clarity by getting peer feedback on tone and jargon, swap technical and non-technical emails, and peers highlight confusing terms. And use mock interviews with observation checklists so that students can assess each other on tone, adaptability and clarity. In task 3, the project proposal, you could use propose, explain, benefit, evidence, justification frameworks, where students need to justify technical recommendations using a structured writing frame. Have some guided discussion on responsible use of AI, so review examples of AI-assisted versus AI-plagiarized work, and students identify the differences in originality and citation. Have a spreadsheet challenge where students compare the total cost of ownership, for example, cloud versus on-site, and write a short justification for their chosen model. And use exemplars and mark schemes for annotation of diagrams, so students can see what high and low quality diagrams look like to model completeness and clarity. For task 4, the survey and project review, use collaborative critique where students design surveys, exchange them and identify missing metrics such as satisfaction or performance. To promote evaluation, use what, why, evidence, next reflection model so students would analyse a project outcome and suggest specific next steps. and then use guided self-assessment forms so learners can evaluate their project performance against the descriptors. Then think about creating a flowchart connecting the purpose of each task to the final evaluation. And now we'll move on to the digital support ESP. So again, we'll first of all look at the strengths. So for task 1, the troubleshooting and test plan, there was a noticeable improvement in the structure and organisation of step-by-step troubleshooting guides. Many students correctly identified the root cause of the wireless issue, and students demonstrated an understanding of network troubleshooting frameworks, for example, fishbone diagram, OSI model, or Cisco methodology. Several responses included logical sequences of checks, for example, verifying Wi-Fi adapter, checking DHCP status, testing connectivity, and ensuring drivers were up to date. There were clear tables with expected results and actions, and these achieved full marks in stronger responses. Then for task 2, the interview and emails, students continued to show strong verbal communication and logical questioning. Many led the interview confidently and adapted based on responses. The email quality improved. The technical email contained relevant terminology and detailed problem-solving language, and students demonstrated improved ability to translate technical content into plain English for non-technical audiences. For task 3, the project proposal, many students recognised key vulnerabilities in cloud soaring technology setup. There was a good awareness of hybrid cloud models using OneDrive with a Windows server, and some strong responses demonstrated RAID, BitLocker and role-based access control. Students consistently used spreadsheets for cost tables, showing subtotals, totals and recurring costs. And the quality of English and report layout improved, with many achieving 3 to 4 marks for the written communication. In task 4, which was the survey and post-project review, many surveys were well structured using rating scales and open and closed questions effectively. Stronger responses combined qualitative and quantitative data to assess system performance and satisfaction. Post-project reviews showed improved ability to link the solutions to the original issues, and there was growing evidence of critical evaluation, so some students commented on how effectively their solutions met the requirements. And now we move on to the areas for development for the ESP digital support. So in task 1, troubleshooting and test plan, many students failed to explain why the issue occurred or why each step was necessary, and some didn't understand verification and validation, offering more fixes instead of testing to confirm the resolution. Monitoring software was underused. For example, few used Task Manager, HW Monitor or CoreTemp to identify issues. And there were limited reference to preventative maintenance, things such as cleaning, malware scans or updates. In task 2, some students were over-reliant on scripted questions, missing opportunities for follow-up. Non-technical emails sometimes contained unexplained jargon, reducing accessibility. In task 3, there was insufficient detail or justification. Many reports lacked reasoning for chosen hardware or software. The integration of systems, so things like how cloud, local server and security tools interact, was poorly explained. AI-generated content reduced originality and depth in some submissions, and hyperlinks included in evidence were inaccessible to assessors. There was a limited cost comparison between cloud and on-site models, and some students submitted only 1 to 2 pages, therefore failing to meet the scope of the task. And then task 4, the survey and post-project review. Some surveys missed key indicators, things like customer satisfaction, performance and usability, and post-project reviews were often descriptive rather than evaluative. Several included irrelevant information from other tasks. There was also limited reflection on how their own performance or process improved. And now we look at some suggested teaching strategies that support with the ESP in digital support. So starting with task 1, you could model root cause reasoning using the 5 whys framework, where students diagnose staged network or hardware faults in virtual machines, identifying both cause and verification test. Use the step why outcome writing frame, so students could rework a troubleshooting step by adding why and what this achieves. Teach the test to prove fix approach, so students would document performance checks to verify repair success. And do some live demonstration of CPU or RAM usage and ensure students know how to record test evidence. Now task 2, the interview and emails. Promote active listening through the adaptive interview exercise, so students would interview peers and must reformulate their next question based on the answer given. Use tone shifting practice for clarity of communication. So for example, rewrite one technical paragraph for a non-technical reader and peers would identify any unclear terms. Promote confidence by doing mock interviews with observation sheets where students can record and self-assess their communication behaviours such as clarity, tone and adaptability. Additionally, here it's worth checking for the audio evidence quality, so do a pre-assessment sound check, conduct test recordings and peer review for clarity and balance. In task 3, the project proposal, you could use the propose, why, benefit, evidence frame, where students justify each proposed change with one technical and one organisational reason. Use a network puzzle exercise, so you could provide cloud, local and hybrid system diagrams and students need to explain data flow, access control and redundancy. You could use a case study of a cyber breach to analyse how lack of endpoint control allowed an attack and students could suggest technical and procedural prevention. It's worth thinking about the ethical use of AI, so compare original versus AI-generated responses, discuss transparency and citation using AI guidance. And then in the comparative analysis task, students could calculate cloud versus on-site costs using real or sample supplier data and then justify their choice in writing. And then for task 4, the survey and post-project review. Do a peer review exercise where students design satisfaction surveys and swap them to identify missing questions or unclear wording. You could scaffold evaluative writing, so model the difference using what happened versus why it mattered type prompts. You could use Gibbs or a what, so what, now what model for students to evaluate a past IT project or a classroom task, focusing on improvement areas. And then you could use a task flow chart where students would map the purpose of each ESP task and how they connect to each other and how task 3 therefore connects to the task 4 evaluation. It's worth noting here that across the ESPs there were some issues identified, particularly around the presentation of work and evidence. So the Chief Examiner noted some inconsistencies in the quality of submitted work, which at times affected its readability and was difficult to mark. So advice includes submit PDF for written reports and use MP3 for audio and try to avoid large or uncommon formats. Avoid using hyperlinks as assessors are unable to access these once converted to PDF. Record in a quiet room, do a mic check and announce a candidate ID and task at the start. Keep provider prompts out of the recording and ensure independence is visible and name files clearly with the centre, candidate, task, component and date. These final few slides will highlight our support offer and additional resources which you may find useful. So please remember the support doesn't stop after this session. There's a range of materials available to help you and your students. On the NCFE qualification page you'll find the Chief Examiner report, student exemplar work and downloadable schemes of work with free teaching materials. There are also recorded CPZ sessions on our YouTube playlist, which you can revisit at any time, and all our upcoming live events are listed on the NCFE T-Level Training events page. And before we finish, we'd really appreciate your feedback on today's session. So you can scan the QR code on the screen here or follow the link to complete a very short survey. This input does help us to refine our training and make sure future sessions are as relevant and useful as possible. Thank you for your time and engagement today. I hope you do leave with some clear practical strategies to support your students in achieving their best.